Scott Fluer has been a member of the Wyoming section for a long time, and he specializes in management of wild horses and burros with the BLM. He's out Lander. Does a lot of other stuff too. But he's going to discuss part of their program and part of a unique way that they're collecting some data related to wild horses, and it looks like other species as well. So let's welcome Scott.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks for having me here today. Grab the changer. I have to admit I've let my SRM membership lapse, and I need to re-up. So, but I've been a pretty active member in the past, and past president of the Wyoming section, chaired the advisory council, and been pretty engaged. But anyway, what I want to do is talk to you a little bit today about the Wild Horse and Burro program. My background is I have a degree in range science from Montana State. I worked for the NRCS. Back then it was the Soil Conservation Service for about 4 to 5 years. And then transferred to the BLM in Lander and worked in the grazing program there. And then most recently in 2010 took on full-time wild horse and burro duties in the Lander office. Some of you have maybe noticed that the Wild Horse and Burro program is getting more and more exposure nationwide and taking more and more time. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about monitoring. What we were trying to do is figure out what wild horses were doing in riparian areas and what kind of use they're making. And it ended up being more of an animal study, if you will. It wasn't just focused on wild horses, and so what I'm going to present today is monitoring basically animal use on riparian areas within the Lander office. As you can see, we use trail cameras for this, and I'll talk a little bit about what we did and how we set these up, and it was really interesting, some of the film footage we collected. Well, the location is central Wyoming. In Wyoming, we have 16 herd management areas for wild horses. I manage 7 of those in the state. We also have about 3,500 to 3,800 wild horses as our appropriate management level. I've got about 1/3 of those on those 7 herd management areas. And it covers just under 1 million acres, those 7 herd management areas. And so we have it's large landscapes, sagebrush steppe, with scattered riparian areas taking up about 1% of the surface acres. I had a fantastic team this summer. Christy and Michelle, both range management students. Christy's a senior this year, and Michelle is in her first year of being a senior. I'm not sure what that is, a long junior or a short senior. But anyway, man, these two were just fantastic. They did a whale of a job. They had fun doing it, and they said to me, we didn't realize how intense this project would be and how much time it actually took. And this PowerPoint, one of my requirements for the two of them at the end was to present their findings and their data to the Lander field office. And so I've kind of robbed their PowerPoint. I've toned it down a little bit. I've kind of spruced it up a little too. And but most of these slides are their slides, and they do want to present this at the Orlando meeting in the student conclave down there. Anyway, the purpose of the animal use monitoring was basically to focus on determining which species were using riparian areas, when they were there, and what they were doing. The method we used, we had 6 trail cameras, 5 of those being bush and elves, 1 being a Reconyx. And what I'd like to do is show you today 4 of those cameras, kind of what we found out on the ground. We basically set these cameras up to take photos every 15 minutes. It would snap 2 photos on a riparian area between the hours of 4 a.m. and 10 p.m. during the hot season, if you will, June and July. And part of that reason is it was difficult to get seasonals hired this year with the sequestration and getting folks on board and the challenge of hiring students. And so our monitoring data was limited to basically about 2.5 months. Also, the cameras were set that if anything passed by the camera, a motion sensor would take photos, whether it be during the day or at night. So, but they were pre-programmed for every 15 minutes between 4 a.m. and 10 p.m. Okay, the data collection here, the memory cards were changed weekly. They had a route that they traveled every week. Pictures were stored on 2 external hard drives. And then they actually built an Excel spreadsheet with a link to the image. And they wrote formulas, and they cataloged and analyzed over 32,000 photos. That's a lot of pictures, let me tell you. And they looked at every one of them, and we're going to look at a few of them. Anyway, here's a real simple spreadsheet that they used, and you can see right here we had the date, of course, the time, the animal, and they used the term cow, and I'll probably be referring to cattle in the presentation today. And then the number of animals seen, what the activity was, and then of course the hyperlink to that image, which is on the external hard drive. Well, we put our brains together to figure out how we were going to classify and determine what those animals were doing out there. And so basically we came up with 3 primary definitions, grazing being that animal had its head down or raised and was obviously chewing. Traveling, the animal appears to be moving in and out of the frame. And that was the reason for 2 photos at the same time, is because if you had an animal right there, you took a picture, you wanted to snap that picture again and see if that animal moved. And that was the idea, to tell if it was traveling. Loafing, was the animal exhibiting lateral or sternal recumbency or standing upright and resting? And then other, was the animal playing, was it nursing, was it fighting, what was it doing? And then, of course, we had the unknown, which is we just aren't sure what that animal was or what triggered the camera. And you'll see some of those today, too. The time period breakdown, we blended time with temperature. And again, this is only the 2nd year of this monitoring, I guess you want to call it a study. I mean, we're learning as we go here, so I'm completely receptive to any thoughts or ideas you may have, and please give me a call at the Lander office or email me. But anyway, we broke down our time periods basically from the hours of 4 a.m. to 10 a.m., calling it the morning hours or the cool time of the day. As we progressed between 10 and 5, we called that the hot part of the day. Cooling was in the evening from 5 o'clock till 10 o'clock, and then we just said, okay, total darkness, was from 10 o'clock on. And so that's sort of how we broke out the time period so we could figure out what was actually going on out there on the ground. We all know the importance of riparian areas. I'm not going to go into that, but basically transitional zones. And again, in this area that we looked at, it was less than 1% of the surface acres are riparian areas, so they're very small, targeted by a lot of different species. And the species we encountered are listed below, everything from wild horses to cattle to antelope, coyotes, rabbits, elk, you name it. So let's take a look at camera 1. It's located in the Muskrat Basin Herd Management Area. And the reason we focused on herd management areas, again, is the controversy and the discussions and the issues around wild horses in riparian areas. Also, I was able to obtain the money from the wild horse program, so we kept it focused within the herd management areas. Now, this camera was located just north of Jeffrey City near Beaver Rim on an area called Long Creek in the Granite Mountain Open Allotment, a grazing allotment. And within the herd management area. This herd management area is about 185,000 acres. It has 160 to 250 wild horses in it, and about 3,500 head of cattle. Anyway, let me tell you, when you set up a trail camera, the challenge is getting that camera fixed to something. Because as you'll see in the photos here, you want to be able to try and hide that camera from people view, from animal view. You don't want to set it on a post because that becomes a rubbing platform for animals. And this one was on a post. It was on a fence line, so the animals were used to seeing that fence line. And then, of course, Scott was big into duct tape. And, you know, I think Tom Hanks used duct tape to get off that island, didn't he? And I don't know if the space shuttle had duct tape on the tiles, but you'll find out that toward the end here that Scott shouldn't have used duct tape. Anyway, we did all this on public land. The beige there being BLM, the white being deeded, and the blue being state land there, just for your information. This is a classic riparian area within this region. Kind of a intermittent, perennial, intermittent stream, sub-irrigated off to the sides, dominated by sedges and rushes, and season-long grazing. Basically, the cattle go out there mid-May, come off the end of October. So let's take a look at our data here. We took roughly 8,700 photos on this site. We established the camera in mid-June, and we determined that in June the animals that use this, 55% of those photographs were cattle, 31% were horses. We had 3% of the photographs being wildlife. And then you can see over here what happened in July, And we had a little bit of a decrease in both horses and cattle, and an increase in no animals. Not sure what's going on or why, but kind of interesting. So we took this and we broke this down a little bit further. This is just, you know, the photos that were snapped. And then, of course, no animals in the photos. In June, we had 370 photos that didn't have any animals at all. So you can see out of the 8,000 photos, a lot of activity going on. Okay, so if we just look at the horse out there, the wild horse, and what went on there, of the photos out there, of those 3,000 in June, we had 1,100 of them being horse photos. And grazing, when they were photographed, 82% of the time they were grazing in those photos. 6% of the time in June they were traveling, and 7% of the time they were loafing. And then again, we carried that on into July. Now, if we jump into cattle activity, 2,000 photos in June compared with the total of 3,000 were with cattle. But you can see here, pretty similar. 67% of the photos with cattle in them were grazing. And then a pretty large amount of time they were loafing. Not a whole lot of time traveling, but they spent more time in there grazing and loafing. And this was real interesting on the next one, wildlife. Wildlife spent a lot of time passing by, traveling through. Kind of interesting. And these are things we've all known, we've seen, we just documented it. And we've all known this. We just went ahead and took pictures, 32,000 plus of them. But anyway, here again, it seems like every animal that entered the riparian area appeared to be grazing for the most part. Wildlife loafed very little. And so kind of keep in mind, we're going to look at 4 of these, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one, about the different grazing that went on during that time period. But again, this was season-long grazing for livestock, year-round use for horses, and year-round use for wildlife. And if you look, we had 8,000 photos, right, on this transect here. If you look at the bottom, add those together, we're just right at 300 total photos for wildlife out of those 8,000. Unknown animals, we couldn't tell in the photo what it was. You know, if it was a foot or, you know, some, I don't know, alien, I don't know what it was. We just couldn't tell, so it was an unknown. And we only had roughly 50-some photos that were unknowns. So pretty conclusive. Now this is interesting. I mean, we've all known this, but we kind of put it in perspective here. If you look at the time of day in June, animals started entering the riparian areas in the morning hours. Remember, our morning was from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., they started kind of hanging out, if you will, in the riparian area. And if you notice here, horses kind of spent a little bit more time than cattle did in June. But in July, horses dropped off a little and cattle picked up. And then as evening approached, things started to cool off. Animals started leaving the riparian area. And at nighttime, they just flat disappeared, other than looks like a little blip there on wildlife. So kind of interesting what's going on there. And I suspect they left the riparian area because that area probably gets cold. You get cold air drainage. And so those animals probably went and bedded away from that area or were out feeding as it cooled off. We also measured stubble height on all these locations and analyzed that as well and collected that information. And again, basically Nebraska sedge, Baltic rush in this area pretty much had continuous use by whatever animal all summer long. Well, our brief analysis on this site basically is that the majority of the animals were there between 10 and 5. Primary activity was grazing. Cows spent a larger part of the day grazing and loafing. Horses stayed a little longer, but no more than a couple hours. And then wildlife were there 15 to 30 minutes. And again, these are observations that my seasonals had. I mean, this is their slide they put together. And the one thing that's interesting, that last sentence about segregation there, the animals tended to come in their family groups. I mean, if it was a group of horses, they came in, they did their thing, and then they left. Here would come the antelope. The antelope would come in, do their thing, and go. And so they kind of tended to stay segregated and kind of respected space at times. And then here's some of the photos. If you take a look here, nostrils. We got cattle up and down the drainage, and if you look at the time, here it is, 9:30 in the morning. Here's mid-July, 12:30 in the afternoon, and so on. And if you look at this, this really shows up well here. These are horses that are grazing. These horses are basically loafing. These horses are doing that other thing, kind of playing around. And so, and you can kind of see that there isn't much for cattle in this photo. All of a sudden the horses are there. So, and then this is interesting too. Sunrise at 5:30 in the morning, nothing going on, totally quiet. There's a horse at 1 o'clock in the afternoon pawing water. This is a coyote, and I blew that up and I looked at that, and that coyote's laying right in that water. And that is 12 o'clock, 00 noon, high noon. And he's laying right there in the water. I was trying to tell if that was a wolf or not in there, but it was a coyote. And then this is interesting. Let's see, 10:30 at night. We got the devil horse or what he is there. But he's coming through. It looks like he's traveling through the photograph. So we always think animals at night kind of bed down and settle out. I thought this was kind of interesting. Anyway, I got to keep rolling. Camera 3 was Antelope Hills. This would be the west area of Green Mountain Common allotment. Some of you have heard about Green Mountain Common. But this is an Antelope Hills herd management area within that grazing allotment of the Green Mountain. Well, we did place all these cameras in known areas of wild horse use. And so we did place this one out on a place, out in Horse Track Spring. And this area is frequented by horses. But what we found interesting this year, and here's a shot of the camera, we had a hard time anchoring this camera down. This ended up being duct taped to 2 angle irons, down low, strapped to sagebrush. It was tough. I heard my name a lot during that time. But anyway, what's interesting here is we didn't have any horse use at all. And the only animals we had in here were cattle and wildlife. And the cattle, I believe, didn't come into this area until about mid-June, out in this allotment, or in this pasture, that allotment. But total pictures in June, we had 1,500. And I started thinking about why weren't the horses there? And it was extremely dry in this area this year. It just really didn't even green up out in this area. And there wasn't much for anything. And I think the horses moved outside of the herd management area. They moved away from this riparian area, and they were seeking green. And it actually didn't green up here until about September, October. So anyway, horse activity, we didn't have any horses, so we felt that they left the area, and they did. And these horses, too, tended to, there's a herd of about, the AML is 60 to 82 head, and they tend to travel in one group. Okay, of cattle activity, we only had 400 photos in June out of the 1,500. It's not a lot of cattle use, but they were grazing and they were loafing. very little travel. Kind of similar pattern to our last transect. Now the livestock grazing in this allotment here is on a rotational basis, but they use topographic and on-the-ground features as pasture boundaries. There's no fixed fences. Everything is sort of kind of rotated using topography and writing. We look at our wildlife activity again. A real high percentage of the time they're traveling through, they're passing through the area, but yet they also stop and graze. Again, out of the 1,500 photos in June, we only had 100 photos there of wildlife. And of course, the unknown. We only had 2 pictures of unknown, and I think I've got them here. I think I know what they are. Time of day, kind of interesting information here. Again, in the morning time, a little bit of cattle use, quite a bit of wildlife use in the morning here. Midday, cattle use increased, wildlife decreased. As evening approached, all animals started leaving, and at nighttime they just sort of left. They were gone. And July, it got a little hotter. Now this is up pretty high. This is the upper 6,000, almost 7,000 feet. Like 6,600, 6,800 feet. So it's pretty cool country for the most part, but even in July it gets warm, and a little bit more time with cattle in the riparian area. And cattle started to come into this area too in July. So we had more animals being introduced into the area. Again, stubble height was taken. You can see here that red top, almost 12 inches tall, and Julo was 5, and then Carrick's here was 2.5. Our analysis here, basically, that cattle and wildlife were seen throughout the day. Primary activity of cattle was grazing. A large part of the time they were loafing as well. Wildlife did come into the area, but they determined less than an hour. Some of the photos here, you can see antelope, of course. We could tell that was an antelope. We have cattle right there. And then this photo here, I got to look at the time. This was cattle. But again, here it is at 9 o'clock at night, and they're up grazing. Kind of interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I guess when you're hungry, but kind of interesting information. Here's the unknowns, I got to looking at this, and I know what this is, I think. Anybody else know what that is? Other than nose? Look at the hair and the way the neck starts. I don't know if it's a 6-point bull or cow, elk. I think that's an elk face right there. Checking out the camera if you look at it. And then, of course, I don't know, it's like a little shadowy image here. I don't know what that is. And then the sky. Those animals come in and they disrupt those cameras, and just check it out. Here's an elk, and I think this is an elk as well. But anyway, and if you look, that elk right there is, what time is that at? 7:30 in the evening, but this one here is about 1:45 in the afternoon. So anyway, kind of fun what these cameras can do. All right, Happy Springs Reservoir, north of Crooks Mountain. It's near the Green Mountain Common grazing allotment as well. Part of the Crooks Mountain herd management area, about 70 to 80 head of horses in there, ideally. Again, it was put on a reservoir. The cattle didn't actually come in there until about July. Again, placed on public land, kind of a north aspect, if you will, in this drainage. So we're kind of on the north side of Crooks Mountain. And here's the reservoir, and I was just really pleased and impressed with how much veg was around here. Quite a bit. And jump into the information here. Now, we took about 6,000 photos on this site. And if you look here, we weren't supposed to have any cattle in here, but we had a few that showed up. So 14% of the pictures were cattle, 5% were horses. So animals really didn't congregate here much. As the temperature increased and cattle started coming into the area, horses stayed the same. Cattle picked up a little bit. Wildlife, of course, yeah, kind of increase, decrease, but kind of interesting. And this area was supposed to be deferred this year from grazing, but plans had to be modified a little bit because of how dry conditions were in our region. Now, if we look at the horse activity, those 5% of the horses out there, only 120 or 300 photos out of those 6,000 were horses. They too were grazing 75% of the time. They loafed a little bit more in this area. If you look here, you got 12%, but they too traveled through about 10% of the time they're traveling. So we look at cattle activity. What I found really interesting here, but it makes sense, is they loafed a lot more than they spent grazing, and it was a reservoir or kind of a dike area. So what do they tend to do? They tend to kind of bed down in that area, and I think also all that cushiony grass was comfortable to lay in, and I think they just kind of were there for part of the time. Very little grazing occurred in these photographs on cattle. They traveled a little bit more through here, and that kind of makes sense when you start thinking about a reservoir situation. Wildlife, a lot of traveling through. Quite a few photos of wildlife. If you look, there's almost 1,000 photos there of wildlife. Again, they did graze a little bit in June. A little bit more grazing occurred in July. A lot more traveling too. And we only have 2 pictures of the unknown. Okay, time of day. This is rather interesting. Of course, typical trend, very few animals within the riparian area early in the morning. As the day wore on, temperatures rose, animals came in and were in the riparian area a little longer. Horses, though, the blue graph, if you look, really didn't do much until the evening. They came in the evening, and then look at that. They were there at night. I'm not sure why those horses did that. Cattle tended to leave in the evening and disappeared altogether, and same in July. But the horses tended to come in the evening in this location and utilize those riparian areas during that time. And again, stubble height was measured. I'm going to roll through this. Okay, a quick analysis here. Basically, the area was used for loafing and drinking. I mean, they came to the reservoir to get drink. Horses were seen while cows used the area for loafing. Last sentence I found kind of interesting. Ducks were in the area in June, but then the ducks left, and they felt it was because the cattle increased. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not. It could be, but maybe the ducks had some other place to go. Further north, I don't know. But anyway, again, observations that's worth looking into further. Okay, some of the photos here. My little buddy, he's not stuffed. But I got to look here again. So this is June 24th. We weren't supposed to have cattle in here. Of course, he's like over there, look. And we have cattle here. We have this guy triggering the camera, so we had a lot of wildlife photos, right? He was out there doing his thing. And then, let's see, this right, these are 2 studs that are fighting here. We have some cattle. We have a horse right here, a gray horse, antelope, and then, of course, here we are again at 2100 hours, which would be, what, 9:30 at night. Horses grazing around the reservoir. Kind of interesting. Now this photo you can't see, but if anybody has an elk tag in this area, those are 3 6-point bulls right there. And they came in at 7:30 at night. That was a highly valued photo for a lot of guys in the office. Here we are, the bird. He showed up. Check out these legs, huh? And then we have a little wild sagebrush bird there. I don't know my birds. I mean, I know that one up there in the corner. But anyway, kind of interesting what's going on with these cameras. Okay, last one. I'll get through this, Brian. Hang with me. This is Wild Horse Spring. My seasonals named it this because there's always horses there. And this is in Whiskey Peak allotment right outside of Muddy Gap. It's in the Green Mountain Herd Management area. 170 to 300 head of horses on about 100,000 acres. But this allotment is rotationally grazed. It is Green Mountain and Whiskey Peak itself, I mean proper, so there's mixed timber in there, there's lodgepole, there's aspen, there's limber pine, quite a few riparian areas. So anyway, we monitored this area on Willow Creek there, and of course you can notice here the difficulties, camera was knocked over, duct tape didn't hold, Scott. So I had camo duct tape too, really good. Anyway, you can see right here is where we have the camera. This would be the Diamond Hook Ranch, if anybody's familiar with that area. Sort of the north shadow of Whiskey Peak, and quite an area that's quite used quite a bit by wild horses. This is the location. Taking a look at that area right there, and it's sort of right at the foot of the mountain. So we're kind of looking to the north and east here. Okay, cattle didn't come into this allotment in Whiskey Peak until I think about July 10th, somewhere right in there. So in June we didn't have any cattle in here. We took a total of 5,000 photos. Of those 5,000 photos, 30% of them were horses in those photos, about 5% wildlife, no cattle. And then cattle were introduced in July, I think around the 5th or the 10th, right in there. You can see you had about 10% of the photos were cattle at that time. Horses dropped off a little bit there. Could be that horses started moving up the mountain. Snow was receding, following the green line maybe. Hard to say. Cattle were coming in. What were those horses doing? Well, half the time they were grazing, and the larger percentage of the time in this area they were loafing and tended to be there. They traveled about the same as the other data sets that we looked at. They tended to travel more. But again, it seems like every animal that gets to the riparian area needs to take a bite. Cattle activity, a lot of grazing and a lot of loafing going on, and a little bit more in traveling time as well. So not a big change. And we didn't have a lot of photos. I can't remember how many we have, several thousand there, but about 300 just cow photos. So. And wildlife, a lot of traveling, once again on wildlife, 30%, grazing, and then a little bit more loafing in this situation. The other data sets showed less loafing versus this transect site. And quite a few photos of wildlife, about 200. Okay, time of day, what went on here, kind of interesting. Horses came in the morning, spent more time during the midday. Evening they started to leave, and at night they basically disappeared. The other data that we looked at, horses increased in the evening. Kind of bizarre. So something's going on in this area. Now we look at cattle and horses, almost identical midday here. Everybody showed up and frequented the riparian area. And then at night they tended to leave. A little bit of horse activity at night, a little bit more wildlife activity, quite a bit of wildlife activity in June at night. So knowing that wildlife are coming in and using that riparian area at night, whether it be for drinking or grazing or what, or loafing, whatever it may be. Again, stubble height was taken and recorded. Quick analysis of this area basically is cattle weren't documented until July. The appearance of horses diminished from June to July. The techs felt that maybe the introduction of cattle pushed the horses out. Hard to say. I kind of think they followed the green zone up because that mountain is got a lot of variety of veg on it. And then also the high wind thing there. It's an area of high winds. If you've ever been to Muddy Gap when the wind's blowing, it can really get to going. So animals seeking shelter out of the wind. And we saw a lot more time loafing in that area too, if you remember on our pie graphs. Okay, real quick, some quick photos here. My text pointed out, this is kind of interesting, July 9th, this was a pregnant mare here, and July 17th, she has a foal. And you can see she's pretty heavy right there. Got some cattle use, and by golly, look at that. Here it is, nighttime again. Those guys are up to something. 9:45 in the evening, 2 horses. So. And you just never know what you might get. This guy buys extra fabric for his knees. You notice he's got extra rivets in there. John, you know who that is? I figured you did. Then we have some more legs. We've got a little buck deer here in the nighttime and a little group of black horses. So I appreciate whoever this is didn't take the camera. Maybe you didn't know it was there. But anyway, okay, in conclusion here, just sort of the obstacles we encountered. Animal left the area, trying to determine if the animal left the area simply by just leaving the frame. You know, you have just that visual path of the camera. You don't know what's going on either side. Topography, sometimes judging that animal's activity was difficult. Sometimes you had the animal standing and blocking the view. Animals blending into the environment, which they're supposed to do, I guess. Accuracy in counting. Placing a camera in the best location. Sometimes the challenge of trying to keep it on public land was challenging. And just anchoring the camera was difficult. And then finally writing the formulas and just the amount of time of logging 32,000 photos. Finally, recommendations that my text gave me is include a temperature log, which I think is wise. Place all the cameras at the same time, and then Scott, no more duct tape. So. Finally, their little observation here basically is cattle grazed and loafed within the area for extended periods of time. Horses would also graze and loaf in the area, but for a shorter period of time, and wildlife spent virtually no time there at all. And I've got a little abstract right here. If anybody's interested, you're welcome to pick it up. And Brian, I'm done. So.
Maybe time for one quick question as we're changing presentations here.
Yeah. No, I can't because I haven't got that far yet, but I need to take a real hard look at how use levels measured in comparison to animal frequency there. One thing we really need to do, also add to recommendations, we need to get those cameras out prior to, earlier in the year. It'd be nice to have them out there, say, for 6 months or even a year's time. And it's just extremely labor intensive, but some good information. So, anyway, give me a call. I'm the only Scott and Lander at the BLM if you want to talk further, or send me an email.